Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Picture this. A man in his late 60s sits alone on a park bench, watching the sun drop behind a row of bare winter trees. He's not scrolling his phone, he's not checking the time. He's simply watching the light change, and there's something in his face. Not sadness, not fear, something closer to peace. That makes a stranger walking past slow down without knowing exactly why. That stranger will forget the moment by evening, but something in them will remember the feeling. That feeling has a name in psychology, and it starts with a question most of us spend our entire lives avoiding. What if the secret to looking and feeling younger has almost nothing to do with what you avoid, and everything to do with what you're finally willing to face? Today, we're going somewhere most self-help content refuses to go. 12 psychological patterns, inspired by Carl Jung's analytical psychology, that appear to explain why certain people carry the years so differently than everyone around them, not because of what they do to their skin, because of what they've done quietly, over decades inside their own minds. And we're going to start with the one most people spend their whole lives running from, because according to Jung, it might be the doorway to everything else on this list. Before we go there, a quick favor. If any part of this lands for you, tell me in the comments which point you think you need most right now. Let me know where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. And if this kind of content means something to you, hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell, because what's coming in this channel is only going to go deeper. Now, let's step into the first room. Number 1. Acceptance of death. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a hospital room in the final hour of a life. Anyone who has sat in that silence will tell you the same strange thing, that somewhere in the middle of the grief, there is also clarity, a stripping away of everything that didn't matter. Jung spent decades working with patients in the second half of life, and he noticed something that unsettled the psychology of his era. The patients most afraid of death were not the oldest. They were often the ones still, deep down, refusing to believe it was coming for them at all. Imagine two people, both 60 years old. One has quietly made peace with the fact that his story has an ending, and he doesn't know when. The other has built an entire private architecture of denial, chasing every trend that promises to outrun time, panicking privately at each new gray hair, each unfamiliar ache, treating every sign of aging as an enemy to be defeated, rather than a fact to be lived alongside. Jungian psychology suggests these two men are not simply experiencing different moods. They are living inside two entirely different relationships with reality itself. And that difference does not stay contained in the mind. It follows a person into every room they enter, into every mirror they pass. This isn't about morbidity. It isn't about giving up or surrendering some fight worth having. It's about something closer to what Jung called individuation reaching its final, most difficult stage, the willingness to hold the whole truth of a human life, beginning and end together, without flinching away from either half. People who avoid this reality entirely often develop what's commonly called a midlife crisis, a frantic, anxious grasping at youth, driven by fear that was never actually named or examined. According to this psychological perspective, that unexamined fear doesn't just sit quietly in the background, it leaks. It shows up as urgency in the voice, as tightness around the eyes, as a kind of low static hum of anxiety that never quite switches off. Here's the part almost no one expects. The people who've done this work, who've actually sat with the reality of their own mortality, instead of sprinting from it, often describe something like relief on the other side. Not despair, relief, as though a weight they'd been unconsciously hauling for years had finally quietly been set down, and a person no longer secretly bracing against the inevitable tends to move through the world differently, lighter, more present, less like someone at war with time, and more like someone simply living inside it. This isn't a scientific claim about slowing biological aging. No psychological framework can promise that. What Jungian psychology suggests instead is something subtler and in some ways more powerful, that the chronic, hidden anxiety of denial has a cost, and that cost is visible. Ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you let yourself sit with the fact that your story, like every story, has an ending, not to despair over it, just to look at it, the way you'd look at a photograph of someone you love? What might change in you if you stopped running from that one simple truth? There's a scene that plays out in therapy offices more often than most people realize. A patient in their 50s or 60s comes in describing a vague, unnamed restlessness, sleeplessness, irritability, a sense that something is wrong even though nothing specific has happened. Weeks into the work, it often becomes clear that beneath the restlessness sits something much simpler and much harder to say out loud. I'm afraid of dying, and I've never told anyone, not even myself. The moment that fear finally gets spoken, something shifts, not because the fear disappears, but because it stops having to hide, and hiding, it turns out, was most of what was exhausting them. Number 2. Shadow integration. A woman I'll call Sarah once described the moment she finally understood her own temper. She'd spent years believing she simply had a short fuse, something to apologize for and manage, never something to actually look at. Then, in a quiet conversation with a therapist, she traced it backward. The temper wasn't random. It flared hardest exactly when someone accused her of being selfish, a word that had followed her since childhood, a word she'd spent 30 years secretly terrified might be true. Jung called this the shadow. Every trait we were taught was unacceptable. Every impulse we learned to disown rather than examine. Sarah's anger wasn't the problem. It was the alarm system for a much older wound she'd never let herself look at directly. Think of the coworker who explodes over something small, then insists almost too quickly that they're not usually like this. Or the friend who can dish out blunt criticism effortlessly, but crumbles the instant anyone offers it back to them. These aren't random personality quirks. Jungian psychology would call them shadow leaks. Moments where the disowned material finally finds a crack in the wall and escapes sideways, usually at the worst possible time, aimed at whoever happens to be standing nearby. Now picture someone who has actually opened that locked door, not recklessly, carefully, over years, in therapy, in journaling, in honest conversation with people they trust. They can say, "I was jealous of you, and I hated that about myself," without collapsing into shame. They can hear "you hurt my feelings" without immediately needing to defend, deflect, or disappear. There is nothing left inside them that requires that kind of guarding, and the absence of that guarding is visible in loosened shoulders, in a jaw that isn't perpetually clenched, in a stillness that reads, to anyone paying attention, as something close to safety. What would it cost you to open that door? Even slightly, not all at once, just one honest look at the one thing about yourself you've never said out loud, not even to the person closest to you. Jung believed this single act, facing the shadow rather than fighting it, was the true beginning of psychological wholeness. Everything else on this list depends, in some way, on this first uncomfortable step. There's a particular scene worth imagining here, a family dinner, the kind with just enough old history in the room that everyone is subtly performing for everyone else. Someone makes an offhand comment, and another person's face changes for half a second before they cover it with a laugh that doesn't quite reach their eyes. Nobody else at the table notices, but that half second is the shadow, briefly surfacing, briefly seen, and then hurried back below the water before anyone can ask about it. Multiply that half second by 10,000 dinners, 10,000 meetings, 10,000 ordinary days, and you start to understand why some people seem to age under an invisible weight that has nothing to do with the calendar. Number 3. Detachment from the persona. You seem so put together. Honestly, I'm just good at hiding it. That exchange, or some version of it, happens constantly, quietly, in offices and dinner parties, and group chats everywhere. Jung called the thing being hidden the persona, the mask each of us wears to move through a social world that demands different things from us in different rooms. A certain amount of mask wearing is simply the price of functioning in society. The danger begins the moment a person forgets they're wearing one at all, and starts believing the mask is the only self they're allowed to have. Imagine a woman who has spent 30 years perfecting the art of being impressive, composed in every meeting, never caught off guard, never seen without her hair done, her opinions polished, her responses rehearsed just enough to sound spontaneous. From the outside, she looks flawless. From the inside, according to Jungian psychology, she is running a kind of permanent surveillance operation on herself, constantly checking, adjusting, managing the gap between who she actually is and who she's decided she's allowed to appear to be. That surveillance never fully switches off, not even at home, not even alone. And vigilance, sustained for decades without rest, has a cost that eventually becomes visible in the face itself, a tightness that never quite unclenches, even in sleep. Now imagine the opposite, someone who trips over their words in a meeting and laughs instead of panicking, someone who says, "Actually, I don't know the answer to that," without flinching. There's a specific kind of lightness in people who've stopped needing the mask to be perfect. And it isn't laziness or carelessness. It's the exhale of someone who finally stopped holding their breath. What might your face look like after even one full year of not performing for anyone? There's a moment worth sitting with here, one almost everyone has lived through in some form. You're in a room full of people you want to impress, and someone asks you a question you don't have a good answer to. In that split second, two entirely different people are available to step forward. One scrambles, deflects, changes the subject, manufactures a confident, sounding non-answer just to avoid the exposure of not knowing. The other simply says, "I'm not sure. Actually, let me think about that." Watch how differently the room responds to each. The scrambling reads as fragile, even when it's technically more polished. The honesty reads as solid, even though it admits a gap. Jungian psychology would say only one of these two people is spending energy they don't have to spend. Number 4. The person you already are. Is this okay to say? Will they think less of me if I admit that? Should I laugh here? Or is that too much? If any version of that internal narration runs quietly under your day, you already know exactly what Jung meant by individuation, but not in the sense of constant transformation. This is about something quieter, the willingness to stop negotiating with your own identity and simply live from inside it, not the goal-driven, ever evolving self we'll return to later in this video. This is about a specific foundational kind of peace, the peace of no longer asking, in every room you enter, "Is this version of me acceptable here?" Picture a young man raised in a household where every choice, his career, his opinions, even his laugh, was quietly graded against his family's expectations. For years, he built his entire personality as a kind of ongoing negotiation, adjusting himself constantly to avoid disappointing people who were, in truth, never going to be fully satisfied no matter what he did. Then, somewhere in his 30s, something shifted. Not a dramatic breakdown, a quiet decision. He stopped auditioning for approval that was never coming. And the strange thing his friends noticed afterward wasn't that he changed who he was. It was that he finally stopped performing a version of who he thought he should be. According to Jungian psychology, this shift from constant self-negotiation to settled self-acceptance removes an entire category of chronic background stress most people never even notice they're carrying, because they've never lived without it. Ask yourself, whose approval are you still quietly performing for? And what would happen if tomorrow you simply stopped? Contrast that with someone still deep inside the negotiation, a woman in her 40s who still calls a parent after every major decision, not for advice but for a verdict, still bracing for disapproval that arrived decades ago and never really left. She isn't weak, she's simply still living inside a courtroom that closed years ago, still waiting for a judge who has long since left the building. Jung would say the work here isn't rebellion, and it isn't cutting anyone off. It's simply closing the courtroom, quietly, on your own terms, and finally stepping outside into a life that answers to no one but you. Number 5. Active imagination. There's a room in the mind that most adults stop visiting somewhere around the time they take their first serious job. Jung called deliberate re-entry into that room active imagination, engaging the creative, symbolic parts of the psyche on purpose Through art, through writing, through music, through nothing more elaborate than allowing your mind to wander somewhere unscheduled. He considered this not a luxury but a psychological necessity, a bridge that, left unused, slowly collapses. Think of someone who used to write short stories as a teenager, then stopped entirely for 20 years under the weight of a career that left no room for it. When she finally picks up a notebook again in her 40s, almost as an experiment, something unexpected happens. Ideas she didn't know she was carrying begin surfacing. Old griefs, forgotten hopes, entire unspoken parts of herself finding language for the first time in decades. Colleagues who've known her for years start commenting, without quite knowing why, that she seems different, sharper, more alive in conversation. Jungian psychology would say the bridge had simply been rebuilt, and something on the other side of it had been waiting the whole time. This doesn't require talent or an audience or anything to show for it at the end. It requires only the willingness to let your mind create without immediately judging what it makes. What did you love making before you learned to ask whether it was good enough to matter? Think about a child left alone with a box of crayons and no instructions. There's no hesitation, no internal committee deciding whether the drawing is worth the paper. That freedom doesn't disappear as we age. It gets buried under decades of being graded, critiqued, and compared. Active imagination, in Jung's sense, is the slow, deliberate work of digging that freedom back out, not to become an artist, but to remember what it feels like to create without an audience judging the result. Number 6. Archetypal playfulness. The myth. Growing up means growing serious, and joy is something you graduate out of somewhere around your first mortgage. The reality, according to Jung, is closer to the opposite. He described an archetype he called the puer aeternus, the eternal child, the part of every psyche capable of wonder, spontaneity, delight in small, ordinary things. Left unchecked, this archetype can trap a person in permanent avoidance of responsibility. But integrated, held alongside genuine adult maturity, it becomes something else entirely. The capacity to remain curious about a world most people have long since stopped noticing. Picture a father in his 50s who, instead of standing at the edge of the playground checking his phone, gets down on the ground and genuinely plays with his kids, not performing patience, but actually engaged, actually delighted by the small absurd universe they've built out of sticks and imagination. Compare that to a man the same age who has quietly, without ever deciding to, stopped finding anything delightful at all, who moves through his days competent, responsible, and almost entirely joyless. Jungian psychology suggests the difference between these two men isn't about circumstance. It's about which archetype they've allowed to stay alive inside them. When is the last time something genuinely delighted you, not impressed you, not entertained you passively, but delighted you the way it might have at 8 years old? If you can't remember, that's not a small detail. That's information. Number 7. Synchronicity awareness. What if the moment that could have changed your life already happened, and you were too distracted to notice it? Jung coined the term synchronicity to describe meaningful coincidence, moments that seem to carry significance beyond simple cause and effect. Skeptics push back on the concept, and that's a fair conversation to have. But underneath the debate about whether synchronicity is real, sits a psychological posture worth examining regardless. Are you the kind of person who notices pattern and meaning in your life, or the kind who has stopped looking entirely? Imagine someone who, after years of feeling stuck in a career that never fit, has a chance conversation on a delayed flight that quietly reroutes the entire direction of their life. Was it fate? Coincidence? Jung would say the label matters less than the attention. The person who noticed that conversation, who stayed open to what it might mean instead of dismissing it as small talk, was living with a kind of awareness that a distracted, closed-off version of themselves would have missed entirely. That ongoing attentiveness to meaning, whether or not you believe in synchronicity as a mystical force, keeps a person engaged with their own life instead of merely passing through it. What's a moment in your own life that felt like more than coincidence? You don't have to explain it. Just notice whether you were paying attention when it happened. There's a particular kind of person who moves through the world collecting these moments like small, quiet treasures, the the song that came on at exactly the right time, the book that fell open to exactly the right page, the stranger's comment that answered a question they'd never said out loud. Whether or not any of it is truly meaningful in some cosmic sense, the habit of noticing keeps a person's eyes open in a way that indifference simply doesn't allow. And an open-eyed life, almost by definition, looks and feels entirely different from a closed one. Number 8. Balanced anima and animus. Jung believed every person carries both an inner feminine dimension, the anima, and an inner masculine dimension, the animus, regardless of gender, and that psychological wholeness depends on integrating both rather than suppressing one to satisfy a narrow cultural script. Picture a man raised to believe that softness was weakness, who spent decades performing only strength, only certainty, only control, and slowly became someone incapable of receiving comfort, even from people who loved him. Now picture a woman raised to believe assertiveness was unattractive, who spent years swallowing her own clarity to keep others comfortable, until she barely recognized her own voice in a room. Jungian psychology would say both of these people are carrying the same wound from opposite directions, an amputated half of their own psyche, quietly draining energy every day it stays disowned. Now imagine each of them, years later, having done the work of reclaiming what they'd suppressed. The man who can finally say, "I need support," without shame. The woman who can finally say no, without apologizing 3 times first. There is a fullness to people who've done this integration, a range of emotional expression that reads, almost instantly, as more alive than the narrower, defended version of themselves they used to present. What half of yourself have you been told, your whole life, not to bring into the room? There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from playing only one note, over and over, for an entire lifetime. Imagine an orchestra with half its instruments permanently silenced. The music might still technically play, but something essential is missing, and everyone in the room can feel the absence even if they can't name it. That's what a life looks like when half the psyche has been locked away out of fear or conditioning. Integration doesn't mean becoming someone new. It means finally letting the whole orchestra play. Number 9. Numinous experiences. A man once described, almost apologetically, the strangest night of his adult life. Nothing dramatic happened. He simply pulled his car over on a long drive home, stepped out into a field with no lights around for miles, and looked up. He said he stood there for nearly 20 minutes, saying nothing, thinking nothing in particular, and that something about the size of the sky made every worry he'd been carrying that week feel, for a moment, almost laughably small. Jung used the word numinous to describe exactly this kind of moment, one that momentarily dissolves the ordinary boundaries of the self, whether it arrives beneath a night sky inside a piece of music that reaches somewhere words can't, or at the edge of the ocean at dawn. Think of the last time something stopped you completely, not because you were told to be impressed, but because some part of you simply had no choice but to pause. Jungian psychology suggests these moments do something important. They interrupt the narrow, self-focused loop most adult minds run on almost constantly, and replace it, briefly, with something larger. People who keep this door open, who let themselves be moved, unguarded, by something bigger than their own daily concerns, tend to describe their lives as fuller, even when nothing measurable about those lives has changed. When was the last time you let yourself be truly, unguardedly awed by something, not photographed it, not captioned it, just stood inside it? Number 10. Dream work. Jung considered dreams a direct transmission from the unconscious, a language the deeper mind uses when the conscious mind refuses to listen any other way. He spent much of his career urging patients to record their dreams, to sit with their strange illogical imagery, instead of dismissing it as noise. Imagine someone who, for months, keeps having the same recurring dream, standing at the edge of a house that's slowly flooding, unable to find the source of the water. She ignores it at first. Then, almost as an experiment, she starts writing it down each morning. Slowly, a pattern emerges. The flooding house appears every time she's been avoiding a difficult conversation in her waking life. The unconscious, it turns out, had been trying to tell her something for months in the only language it had available. This kind of ongoing dialogue with your own depths, however strange or inconvenient the imagery, tends to produce a specific kind of clarity that's difficult to access any other way. What has your own unconscious been trying to tell you, in a language you haven't yet learned to read? Most people wake up and let the dream dissolve within minutes, treating it as static, as nothing. But Jung spent his career arguing the opposite, that dreams are the unconscious speaking in the only vocabulary it has, images instead of words, and that ignoring them is a little like receiving letters every night and throwing them away unopened. You don't need to become an expert in symbolism. You just need to start opening the letters. Number 11. Self-actualization drive. Aren't I too old for this? The new student asks, sitting down at the piano for the first time at 62. Her teacher doesn't hesitate. You're not behind. You're just starting a different chapter than the one you started at 8. Jung, along with the humanistic psychologists who built on his foundation, would have agreed entirely. He insisted that psychological growth doesn't have an expiration date somewhere in early adulthood. It's meant to continue, quietly, persistently, for as long as a person is alive. Picture that same woman a year later, hands still a little stiff, progress still slow, but something in her eyes, according to everyone who knows her, has changed completely. Compare that to someone the same age who quietly decided, years ago without ever formally deciding, that their growing was finished, that whatever they were going to become, they'd already become. Jungian psychology would say the difference between these two people isn't talent, or opportunity, or even circumstance. It's whether the engine of growth has been allowed to keep running. What have you been putting off learning? Not because you couldn't, but because some part of you decided it was too late to start. There's an old, quiet myth we tell ourselves without ever examining it, that growth belongs to the young, and that everyone else is simply managing what they've already become. Jung rejected this outright. He believed the second half of life carried its own entirely distinct developmental tasks, different from the first half, but no less important, no less alive. The piano teacher who takes on a 60-year-old beginner will often tell you the same thing. They're not the slowest students in the room. They're often the most present, because they've stopped needing to prove anything to anyone and started simply wanting to learn. Number 12. The story still being written. We began this video with acceptance, sitting with the ending of the story. We close with something almost like its opposite, and yet somehow its natural completion, the willingness to keep the rest of the story unwritten. Jung described individuation as lifelong, not because a person keeps becoming a different self, but because the self keeps revealing more of itself, chapter by chapter, for as long as a person stays curious enough to keep turning the page. Imagine someone at 70 who still asks, out loud, who am I still becoming? Not with anxiety, with genuine curiosity, the way you might ask about a book you haven't finished reading yet. This is entirely different from restlessness or dissatisfaction. It's the opposite of a person who long ago decided their identity was a closed file, permanently filed away, nothing left to add. Jungian psychology suggests that people who keep this question alive, who remain willing to be surprised by their own continuing development, carry a kind of forward motion that has almost nothing to do with age and almost everything to do with orientation. So here we are, 12 rooms later, back where we started, except everything looks different now. A man on a park bench, watching the light change, at peace with an ending he can't control, and somehow, in that same breath, still curious about everything that comes before it. None of what we've covered today is a promise that the body stops aging, or that any of these 12 practices can be measured on a lab chart and proven to add years to a life. Jung never claimed this himself, and no serious reading of his work suggests it. These are psychological interpretations, inspired by his framework, not clinical findings. What his work does suggest, gently and speculatively, is this: the chronic, invisible cost of self-denial, self-suppression, and unexamined fear shows up somewhere, and the chronic, quiet relief of honesty, integration, and acceptance shows up somewhere too. Which one has been running underneath your life, mostly unnoticed? For years, think back to that man on the park bench. The one we began with. He isn't remarkable because he found some secret the rest of us haven't. He's remarkable because he stopped running from 12 rooms most people spend their whole lives avoiding. One hallway at a time for decades, without ever expecting applause for it. That's not a formula you can apply overnight. It's not a checklist you finish by Friday. It's a direction you turn toward. A little more each year, for as long as you're willing to keep walking. If any part of this reached something real in you, say so in the comments. Which of these 12 points landed hardest, and why? And if you want to keep going deeper into this world with me, subscribe, turn on the bell, and I'll see you inside the next room.